Welcome everyone to Talking Politics, a virtual series that is jointly organized by the University of Chicago's Center for Study of Communication and Society, the University of Colorado's Colorado Boulder's Program in Culture, Language, and Social Practice, and Brown University's Department of Anthropology. My name is Mervenur Çetin. I'm a second-year PhD student at University of Colorado Boulder, and I will be the moderator and discussant for today's webinar. I want to thank you all so much for joining us for this third edition of Talking Politics, where experts examine how language and other media shape the nexus of race, history, and political institutions. This year's edition primarily focuses on the run-up to the aftermath of the 2024 US presidential election, but our programming also tracks the global movement of political discourses, media, and messages. Today, we are very happy to have Dr. Leah Sprain from University of Colorado Boulder Communication Department giving a presentation titled as Making Non-Answers Hearable, which is a project I've had the privilege of contributing to as a research assistant. After the presentation, I will provide some discussion comments, and then we will open the floor for a Q&A session. To ask a question, you might look at the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you click on the button, any window will pop up where you may post a question. We encourage questions at any time during the webinar, and we will try our best to answer as many of them as we can after the presentation. However, we understand that politics is a delicate subject, and to encourage a constructive and fruitful experience for everyone, including our presenters, we will be closely moderating the discussion as well as removing any inappropriate and unconstructive content from the Q&A section. Without further ado, let me pass the time over to Leah Sprain for today.
Fantastic. Thank you for that welcome. And I'm really excited to be here with all of you. With luck, I've now delayed long enough that you can see the slides that I'm trying to share. This is a project that has been done collaboratively, so to have the opportunity to work with someone who has been part of the Talking Politics series and for to be in discussion here with you all as part of that is a particularly special treat. I'll be talking a little bit more than I often would about this project by giving you a bit of its origin story, because I think in a lot of ways, the encounters and experiences that started this project have really shaped a number of the questions and the phenomena that I'm interested in. And at the same time, I hope we can have some of the kind of broader issues beyond those questions come up if you think at moments we're being too narrow or too small, or if you see other kind of possibilities for provocation beyond what we focused on. This talk then starts by thinking about some experience that I had on the western slope of Colorado in an area that is more kind of conservative, especially historically. And in August 22, there was a group from CU Boulder's Office of Public Outreach and Engagement that was trying to bring together people from the university and folks in this area of Colorado, recognizing that our university doesn't always serve the entire state, trying to bring us to another area to have conversations with local community organizations that were interested in political polarization. And out of those conversations, someone from the League of Women Voters really wanted to talk about how to ask questions at candidate forums. As some of you may know, the League of Women Voters has been working in the United States for 105 years, and they support democracy at all levels in a variety of ways. But one of the key ways they've often done this is by hosting candidate forums from the local elections all up through state elections. And as you'll see here, the League really thinks about itself by these taglines that you see in the image on your slide: empowering voters and defending democracy. And so I was willing to kind of respond to their desire to think about how to ask questions. I met first with a local group from the Western Slope and then the statewide group of representatives from the League of Women Voters to really think about this question about how to ask questions in their forums. I drew heavily on research that had been done in conversation analysis and discourse analysis, both about what we know about questions, what we know about how to ask questions, but also what we know about political contexts, especially interviews and different forms of adversarial questions and so on. And in these conversations, I really got a sense of their issues and problems. So we had conversations about whether it made sense to fact check, the difficulty of running candidate forums in a time of polarization, what it means for them to be nonpartisan, but also defend democracy at a time when even asking questions about some mundane democratic practices was seen as a polarizing partisan issue. The League, despite their long history, has also sometimes been caught up in this moment we're all in. They've had candidates who've threatened and in some cases have refused to attend their forums. There sometimes are perceptions that they're biased. And so they, in a variety of ways, helped me understand the ways in which they saw their participation in these candidate forums, both as vital, but also as problematic in a number of ways. And these conversations then led me to continue to do research beyond just the 2022 election cycle. And I started developing a database to really think about how to make sense of debates and candidate forums, recognizing the participants' own sense that what they were doing had problems and dilemmas within it. And so I used approaches that you'll be hearing more about, grounded practical theory and action implicative discourse analysis, that really have this orientation to research of thinking about research not just as a scientific explanation, but as a way that we can understand human action and try to cultivate practices. And so I could kind of attend to these debates and candidate forums as communication practices and think about how I help people like these League of Women Voters volunteers really reflect critically about their actions and the goals that they're trying to accomplish. Now, as I was doing that, some of the data that was in our database started to go viral. And I have to say, in my experience as an academic, it is not often that my data goes viral. This is just one example from our data set that went viral. There were multiple. I'm going to show you a bit of this TikTok video that comes from a Republican primary debate here in Colorado, hosted by someone called Kyle Clark. And we're going to watch a little bit of this TikTok video, and then we're going to talk about it.
You resigned your position as House Minority Leader after your drunk driving arrest surfaced this year. And my question is not about what you did while drunk, which for anybody who missed it was speeding up I-25 at 90 miles per hour so fast a trooper thought that you were trying to race him. Then you reached for your gun during the traffic stop. You asked the trooper to call the state patrol's lobbyist. Then you asked him to keep the arrest out of the media. My question to you is about what you did while sober. You did not disclose your drunk driving arrest to your Republican colleagues when they were considering you for leader and electing you. Yeah. What does that tell voters about your judgment?
Well, thank you, Kyle, for that. I mean,
Did a mistake not to tell your colleagues when they were considering you for leader, knowing that you had something so big and embarrassing in your recent past?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, this happened to me.
That was about the softest reference that he could have made, but you want to talk about the theater thing?
Sure. So, Kyle, I certainly have owned up to my night out in Denver. Go back to
we're not going to do that. You had plenty of time to answer the question. You chose not to. Sure. That's fine. I just want to make sure. And you have apologized for the theater incident.
I certainly have.
And I just want to make sure. Did you apologize for the behavior that went on with you and your date or the vaping, or did you apologize, or pardon me, or did you apologize for lying to voters about what you did that night and the disrespect that you showed to service workers that night? What specifically were you apologizing?
I don't believe getting footage and releasing that. And people seeing this in a very private moment.
Certainly. It was very important to figure out whether you were telling the truth or whether a public agency was lying about your conduct. Either way was very important for folks to find out. Thank you very much. We're going to talk about earmarks in Congress. Let's talk about the use of
gifted that
earmarks in
very
Congress.
same thing and released it to
Members
the world.
request funding for pet projects. You told a State House colleague who had lost his son in the Aurora Theater shooting that he needed to let go of his son's murder. You called a legislator of color buckwheat during a floor debate. You suggested that people with disabilities are like people who took the risk of running with the bulls in Pamplona. And you suggested that Miss Boebert dresses like a prostitute. Do you regret saying any of those things? And why do you talk to people like that?
Yep, when we had that. But I don't want to talk about that. Let me tell you what I want to talk about.
Well, actually, this
I
is
wanna
free
talk
swim.
about-
I asked a question.
Please allow me to finish.
Let me just ask you. The question was, do you regret saying any of those things? And why do you speak to people that way? Do you regret saying that Miss Boebert, a sitting congresswoman, dresses like a prostitute?
So
Don't dress for half the total.
So no doubt we could spend the rest of this time thinking about some of the differences perhaps between what makes a primary in one congressional district debate go viral and some of the kind of democratic goals that a group like the League of Women Voters has. But I bring up this juxtaposition in part because I think it helps us think about the range of possibilities for how candidate debates and forums are set up and all the different both choices that are made in terms of how they're set up, the skill that's necessary to moderate a debate, and the ways in which doing this can both be satisfying or less satisfying in a variety of ways. Multiple of these clips go viral, and all sorts of people online say things like, the controlled level of contempt that he has for lying and stupidity and his attempt to hold people to an honest answer is sensational. Please make him moderator of any and all debates. At the same time, going viral and being open to the type of partisan attacks that Kyle Clark absolutely gets is not necessarily the objective of a League of Women Voters. So part of what we have is both the kind of visceral, emotional satisfaction of politicians being held to task, of a moderator who refuses to let them kind of steamroll things and is very much in charge, who pursues answers, and when answers aren't provided, makes that clear that it's the candidate's fault, not the moderator. And at the same time, if I were to tell the League of Women Voters that this is what they should be doing in their forums, they would look at me like I was bonkers. And so I start with this juxtaposition between the League of Women Voters and Kyle Clark to suggest that part of where I started my project is really with the question that the League of Women Voters was asking, which was how to ask questions that candidates answer. And if any of you know something about questions, one, there isn't any form or any format or any magic trick that will guarantee that a question will be asked to a politician and that they will answer it, despite some of the rhetorical sophistication we see from folks like Kyle Clark. And at the same time, that if the League of Women Voters is interested in getting answers, they're likely to face a bunch of techniques that they really aren't interested in. And so instead of focusing on how to ask questions that candidates answer, over time and with engagement with them, I started posing a slightly different question, which is how to help audiences hear when candidates dodge and don't answer questions and don't answer. Now, this is a move that is recognized in part because, as Bob Craig and Karen Tracy tell us in their work on grounded practical theory, problem formulations carry blame pointers. And even the subtle shift in how we ask questions points blames in slightly different ways. And I'm going to argue that these blame pointers might actually be really important for not only the range of techniques it opens up, but the ways in which it kind of addresses some of the fundamental concerns of a group like the League of Women Voters. If we formulate the problem not as how we ask questions, but instead how we help audiences hear non-answers, we have a problem formulation that both resonates with publics, it blames familiar candidate behavior rather than putting more focus on the moderator, And it may, and here I'm on shakier ground, have the potential to reduce the attribution of partisan bias if it's pursued in ways that don't feel quite as targeted as some of the ways in which question and answer pursuit sometimes appears. So to build this a little bit of romp through social science. People want answers from politicians. I could give you lots of citations here, but my hunch is this resonates with your experience because it's the common expectation. In turn, people get really mad when politicians don't answer questions. And here's the rub. People tend to actually be bad at noticing non-answers despite their distaste for when it doesn't happen. So this set of premises is based on a lot of social science. The pervasive perception is that when politicians are asked questions, they rarely answer them. This is true in candidate debates and forums. It's true in interviews. The notion of kind of spin and answering the question you wish you were asked and just doing whatever you want to address the topic but not the question. All of these are familiar ways that dodging questions can happen, even within the sociolinguistics literature. Dodging a question can take lots of forms. We can see ways in which people deflect and divert, equivocate and evade, deal with topics in a variety of ways, from topic slides and topic shifts to off-topic topic responses. And a bunch of good social science, especially in conversation analysis, has shown us a lot about what these evasion techniques look like. We've studied how politicians flat refuse to answer questions, provide partial or incomplete answers, say yes or no without elaboration, such that their yes or no are not actually answers, and not all the way to doing more sophisticated things like paraphrasing the question at hand, only to modify the question in a way that both facilitates and cancels the shift in the agenda. Okay, so we know actually a fair amount about how politicians evade questions, but experiments show that audiences, despite being deeply invested in this behavior, aren't actually good at identifying common dodging techniques. So this is something that really annoys us about politicians. And I think part of why Kyle Clark's videos go viral is we get satisfaction when we have a sense of justice that politicians are being held to account. And yet we're still not great at identifying when it's happening at real time. And this, of course, matters because dodging is deeply sensible for politicians. It makes a lot of sense why they sometimes don't answer the question. This is a piece of data that we'll look at in more detail a little bit later, but I'll just show you the beginning of this clip from the Trump and Biden debate in 2024.
Let's not act like children.
President Trump, we're going to
21
Let's not act like children.
You are
a
a child.
specific concern that voters have about you. Will you pledge tonight that once all legal challenges have been exhausted, that you will accept the results of this election, regardless of who wins, and you will say right now that political violence in any form is unacceptable?
Well, I shouldn't have to say that, but of course I believe that. It's totally unacceptable. And if you would see my statements that I made on...
You'll hear a little bit more of his long ramble response. But to be clear, Donald Trump has no interest in answering the question of whether or not he pledges to accept the results of the election, regardless of who wins. His supporters don't need him to say this out loud, and certainly his opponents don't. And so it is only one of the versions in which dodging makes a whole lot more sense than answering the real question for a politician. And so this gives us in this familiar territory that we have a behavior that annoys the public. It happens anyway. And into this space in which we then turn to grounded practical theory and action implicative discourse analysis to think about what we then do with this practice of candidate debates and how we might think about how they get set up and moderated a little bit differently. Both of these terms come to us from the communication discipline, and for an interdisciplinary audience, they may be familiar-ish. Grounded practical theory is a play on grounded theory, although the practical here is doing really important work. Grounded practical theory is a meta-theoretical framework that really says we should develop theory that informs reflective thinking about how to do a particular communication practice. In our case, debates and candidate forums. And that the groundedness means that engaging with empirical practices as they actually are done is a good job of helping researchers sufficiently understand the practice so that they can offer compelling ideas about how to cultivate it. And here we draw on action implicative discourse analysis to do discourse analysis of actual candidate debates and forums to try to understand both how they're currently done and then ask these kind of broader normative questions about what we'd want them to look like. Now, grounded practical theory frequently focuses on what's called the problem level, the dilemmas and tensions that arise in a practice. And we use that as a starting point in this project too. We both thought about some previously identified dilemmas active within these debates. For example, the idea that journalists' commitments to impartiality and adversarialness often kind of led to competing wills. Some of the dilemmas that I actually formulated and discussed with the League of Women Voters about how to ask candidate questions. So how is it that you're nonpartisan and you defend democracy, especially in these times? And the initial analysis around these dilemmas, as well as the engagement with the League of Women Voters, led us to this reconstruction of the philosophical level by recommending a situated ideal for moderators to make non-answers hearable. As much as possible, we've tried to keep this audience in mind. And so we've tried to be selective about how much technical jargon and how many specific discourse analytic vocabulary we use, because we're interested in a lay audience being able to take and use this information. This is something I'm highlighting in part because you all, as more of a specialized audience, may have suggestions or provocations on things that we haven't used and would be better served to use, or the types of insights we can get through discourse analysis that are worth explicating and explaining and making available to lay audiences. So this is where I think it's partly an art, and I'm interested if that's part of the conversation we end up having. To do our grounded practical theory and action implicative discourse analysis, we turn to an empirical data set. In surprising ways, we have a lot of League of Women Voters forums, and we don't formally use them as data for this project. Normally, that would be a red flag, because the reason why we don't use them is as we looked at League of Women Voters forums, we realized they weren't really using any techniques that helped us think about this question of how to make non-answers hearable. Typically, I think that would be a bad sign, but in this case, it's a good one, and here's why. It means that we were able to find lots of examples of public debates that had techniques that we thought were interesting and compelling, examples of what moderators could do to help make this kind of common problem, the non-answer, easier for audiences to recognize. And those techniques were basically entirely missing from League of Women Voters forums. And so this provides us an opportunity to learn from other debates and moderation strategies, and then try to put that in and connect it to principles and premises and ideas that the League might be able to take on, especially because we think that some of these techniques can be used without major risk of being seen as biased, which we know is important to them. Okay, so we structure our analysis and findings around kind of a conclusion, one that at this point I've said multiple times, that we provide a new situated premise. This doesn't come from our data. It comes from kind of engagement with the problems and thinking about with the League and looking at empirical analysis and trying to say what happens if one of the goals of what you're trying to do is to make non-answers hearable. And from that, we then bring moderator techniques for highlighting non-answers. And then we've tried to order these from the least to the most risky in terms of the likely attribution of partisan bias. I want to be clear here, fully predicting what is going to be seen as partisan bias within a candidate forum between partisans at a time of affective polarization is not a straightforward task. There are all sorts of actions that I think are likely to be criticizable, especially by motivated partisans who feel like their candidate is under attack and it's their responsibility to call out anyone who treats them unfairly. So the level of what might count as least risky for a group like League of Women Voters might have to, in some cases, be relatively low. I think the good news is we found some techniques that, at least I would argue, fit in that category. The first one is as simple as this. In a setup where two candidates are going to be asked the same question, and almost all league forums do this, they ask a single question of multiple people. The technique is as simple as repeating the question between the debaters. So Nora O'Donnell in the Harris-Trump debate, simply in between the turns says, "Governor, do you want to respond to that? What has Kamala Harris done for the middle class?" By restating the question, audiences are reminded of the question instead of just the previous response alone. And this technique can be used without altering any other part of the debate format, such as time limits or speakers. And part of how this technique helps make evasion hearable is sometimes it ends up producing situations where candidates actually initiate their response with non-topical evasion. We'll see this in our next example, where this is a case where the moderator actually restates the question during the turn assignment, and then we can hear what happens in response. This is the same example that I already showed you the first clip of. We'll start again from the beginning, and we'll hear the initial question, the non-answer, in this case, also Biden's response, and then a follow-up question. And what I want you to be listening for is both how you might recognize the initial non-answer, see if you're better than some of those people participating in experiments, but also in the follow-up, what Trump does in response to the follow-up question.
Okay,
Let's
let's
not act like children.
President Trump, we're going to turn
Let's not act like children.
You are
to
a
a
child.
specific concern that voters have about you. Will you pledge tonight that once all legal challenges have been exhausted, that you will accept the results of this election, regardless of who wins, and you will say right now that political violence in any form is unacceptable?
Well, I shouldn't have to say that, but of course I believe that. It's totally unacceptable. And if you would see my statements that I made on Twitter at the time, and also my statement that I made in the Rose Garden, you would say it's one of the strongest statements you've ever seen. In addition to the speech I made in front of, I believe, the largest crowd I've ever spoken to. And I will tell you, nobody ever talks about that. They talk about a relatively small number of people that went to the Capitol, and in many cases were ushered in by the police. And as Nancy Pelosi said, it was her responsibility, not mine. She said that loud and clear. But the answer is, if the election is fair, free, and I want that more than anybody. And I'll tell you something. I wish he was a great president, because I wouldn't be here right now. I'd be at one of my many places enjoying myself. I wouldn't be under indictment because I wouldn't have been his political opponent, because he indicted me because I was his opponent. I wish he was a great president. I would rather have that. I wouldn't be here. I don't mind being here. The only reason I'm here is he's so bad as a president that I'm going to make America great again. We're going to make America great again. We're a failing nation right now. We're a seriously failing nation. And we're a failing nation because of him. His policies are so bad. His military policies are insane. They're insane. These are wars that will never end with him. He will drive us into World War III, and we're closer to World War III than anybody can imagine. We are very, very close to World War III, and he's driving us there. And Kim Jong-un and President Xi of China, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, all of these, Putin, they don't respect him. They don't fear him. They have nothing going with this gentleman, and he's going to drive us into World War III.
You want a World War III, let him follow and win, and let Putin say, do what you want, NATO. Just do what you want. There's a thing called Article 5. An attack on one is attack on all. Required response. The idea, I can't think of a single major leader in the world who wouldn't trade places with the job I've done, what they've done. Because we are a powerful nation. We have wonderful peace because of the people, not me, it's because of the American people. They're capable of anything and they step up when they're needed. And right now, we're needed. We're needed to protect the world because our own safety is at stake. And again, you want to have a war, just let Putin go ahead and take Kyiv, make sure they move on, see what happens in Poland, Hungary, and other places along that border. Then you have a war.
President Trump, as I come back to you for a follow-up, the question was, will you accept the results of this election, regardless of who wins?
Just to finish what he said, if I might, Russia.
So like the previous example, the moderator indicated the next speaker and his opportunity for a follow-up question before restating the question. The answer here is initiated by just to finish what he said, which indicates a topical shift from the question itself. This preferencing would not have been needed if the question wasn't restated. As such, the restated question ends up prompting the speaker in this case to mark their own shift away from the question, making it a little easier to hear a quick move to non-answering. The next technique we see happening also frequently, especially in one presidential debate, where the moderators multiple times note the unused time. Frequently in these debates, candidates are given 2 minutes or 1.5 minutes, and so they have time remaining in their initial response. They provide the time they have remaining, and then they restate the original question. Part of what this does is frame the follow-up within a relatively uncontroversial responsibility of the moderator, that is, to keep the time. Drawing attention to time remaining ends up being a way to mark a pattern, at least within this debate. When politicians didn't use their time, more often or not, their response evaded the question. And this moderator response uses the time remaining to reassert the question, thereby implying that more could be said about the question. This is an indirect strategy to draw attention to non-answers. Of note, moderators did not remind candidates of time remaining after every question when they, in fact, had time remaining. In other words, this can be used by moderators selectively when they sense a question has not been fully addressed. Yet by drawing attention to time remaining and leaving the accusation of not answering the question implicit, the moderator is less likely to be seen as acting outside of their role or having political bias. The next technique we see is where we have moderators asking the question again with meta commentary that begins to highlight aspects of the question. In this case, a yes/no binary. So David Muir says, your time is up. Just to clarify the question, do you believe it's in the US best interest for Ukraine to win this war? Yes or no? Here, again, we have a noticing of time, although it's for the previous turn. And then the question is asked again with the meta discourse, just to clarify the question. This turn is only sensible if the question hasn't been answered. Yet the meta discourse points to the responsibility for the need to clarify the question. The question is being asked as a yes/no binary, and this yes/no is also asked as an additional tag. And this reinforces the expectation that the answer should come in a form of a yes/no due to the question form and the lack of time. Also, potentially cueing our expectations for what type of response we should be able to hear. This technique is then made a little more direct in our next technique, where we see people asking tilted yes/no questions with additional meta commentary. Here we have data from Kyle Clark. I told you he was in our data set. He lays out the question in a more elaborate way, and then at the end of that says, my question for you is this, just a short answer. It is truly a yes or no question. If you were the deciding vote, would you have still voted no and killed all of those projects in Colorado that you now take credit for? Here, the moderator uses meta commentary to draw attention to him asking a question. My question for you is this. Before directing a preferred response form, just a short answer, he draws attention to the yes/no binary by preferencing it as truly a yes/no question, creating expectations for a proper response. The question pushes the candidate to account for an inconsistency in her record. She voted against a bill that she touts as bringing money to her district, and he pushes her to answer this question of whether she would have voted against it if she was the deciding vote that likely would have resulted in killing the projects that benefit the people in her district. Now, any response to this question likely makes the politician look bad. Evasion is entirely sensible for the politician here. As such, this turn likely portrays the journalist as asking tough questions, and it seems likely that here we start having partisan audiences who would probably see this as an unanswerable question, as unfair to their candidate, as going after her. At minimum, this question opens the journalist to accusations of targeting and bias. You may now sense where we are in our progression of techniques. The next technique we see is pursuing an answer with sanctions for evasion. Here we turn to another one of the presidential debates where we see an exchange where the moderator is going to attempt to ask the question multiple times.
President
Trump, we have a
these
lot
are
of
not good
issues
things
that we
for the
have to get
environment,
to
as she
out of
understands.
time. Thank you.
Lindsay, thank you. We have an election in just 56 days. And I want to talk about the peaceful transfer of power, which, of course, we all know is a cornerstone of our democracy, and the role of a president in a moment of crisis. Mr. President, on January 6th, you told your supporters to march to the Capitol. You said you would be right there with them. The country and the world saw what played out at the Capitol that day, the officers coming under attack. Aides in the West Wing say you watched it unfold on television off the Oval Office. You did send out tweets, but it was more than 2 hours before you sent out that video message telling your supporters to go home. Is there anything you regret about what you did on that day?
You just said a thing that isn't covered. Peacefully and patriotically, I said during my speech, not later on. Peacefully and patriotically. And nobody on the other side was killed. Ashley Babbitt was shot by an out-of-control police officer that should have never, ever shot her. It's a disgrace. But we didn't do this group of people that have been treated so badly. I ask, what about all the people that are pouring into our country and killing people that she allowed to pour in? She was the border czar, remember that. She was the border czar. She doesn't want to be called the border czar because she's embarrassed by the border. In fact, she said at the beginning, oh, I'm surprised you're not talking about the border yet. That's because she knows what a bad job they've done. What about those people? When are they going to be prosecuted? When are these people from countries all over the world, not just South America? They're coming in from all over the world, David, all over the world. And crime rates are down all over the world because of it.
But let me just
when are those, David, when are those people going to be prosecuted? When are the people that burned down Minneapolis going to be prosecuted? Or in Seattle? They went into Seattle. They took over a big percentage of the city of Seattle. When are those people going to be prosecuted?
But let me just ask
you. You might ask her that question.
You were the president. You were watching it unfold on television. It's a very simple question as we move forward toward another election. Is there anything you regret about what you did on that day? Yes or no?
I had nothing to do with that other than they asked me to make a speech. I showed up for a speech. I said, I think it's going to be big. I went to Nancy Pelosi and the mayor of Washington, D.C., and the mayor put it back in writing, as you know. I said, you know, this is going to be a very big rally or whatever you want to call it. And again, it wasn't done by me. It was done by others. I said, I'd like to give you 10,000 National Guard or soldiers. They rejected me. Nancy Pelosi rejected me. It was just 2 weeks ago. Her daughter has a tape of her saying she is fully responsible for what happened. They want to get rid of that tape. It would have never happened if Nancy Pelosi and the mayor of Washington did their jobs. I wasn't responsible for security. Nancy Pelosi was responsible. She didn't do her job.
The question was about you as president, not about former Speaker Pelosi, but I do want Vice President Harris to respond here.
I was at the Capitol on January 6th.
This exchange shows the moderator attempting to ask the question 4 times. The second and third attempts are interrupted by the candidate attempting to shift the question and the burden of proof onto his opponent. And the fourth attempt starts with a declarative statement that positioned Trump as the president who watched January 6 riots unfold on television. Meta commentary comes next by calling it a very simple question, intensifying the answerability of the question, particularly as we move forward toward another election. The question is asked again with yes, no as a given set of responses. This continued pursuit of an answer with increased attention to the inadequacy of the prior response. This also sanctions the interviewee or the candidate resistance in ways that are likely to open the journalist to accusations that the candidate was kind of pointing to inappropriate behavior and legitimizes their professional role to ask kind of simple questions. Here we move into a set of techniques where we started having moderators just identify a question as unanswered. Kyle Clark says, okay, I was hopeful for an answer about what would happen if folks followed your advice and pulled the kids out of public schools, but we'll leave that for another conversation. Here, the moderator bemoaning he was hopeful for an answer before reminding the audience of the specific scenario that is left unexplained. This closing is also ironic in that it uses humor to mark the lack of an answer now. Meta-communicating about the speaker responded to a combination with, again, ends up marking the question as unanswered. Identifying a question as unanswered means the journalist identifying bad candidate behavior. Here we start having those blame pointers coming out. Whether or not this is viewed as within the moderator's role, calling out evasion, likely depends on the audience. The next thing we'll see is identifying the question as unanswered and then pursuing answer. This comes to us from another Kyle Clark debate. If you sense that he stars in a particular end of our spectrum, you're getting that right. So this next example will start with the moderator accusing the candidate of not making an attempt to answer the question with how she would enact a promise to deport migrants currently in the state of Colorado.
Ms. Bober, you're running an ad right now that says deport them all. That would be an enormous, unprecedented government action. So if you would please describe in detail how you see mass deportation playing out in the cities and towns of the 4th Congressional District, and include, if you would, who you think should be doing the rounding up, where folks would be detained before they're deported and so forth.
First of all, having over 10 million illegal aliens coming into our country in under 4 years, this is unprecedented. And this is a massive lift from the federal government. When you have Joe Biden's administration flying illegal aliens from our border, from Central America into our interior, this is a problem. If they can fly them in, they can certainly fly them out. If buses can bring them in, buses can bring them out. We have got to secure the border. And Congress needs to use the power of the purse as leverage to get that finished and actually secure the southern border. We are impacted by this in Colorado with fentanyl overdoses, with having to defund our law enforcement officers, our firefighters. These are important jobs where funding is being cut because of the illegal aliens and the invasion that is taking place. This is a humanitarian crisis. We need President Trump back in office to ultimately see this through. But I take this so seriously that I led the charge to impeach Joe Biden for his dereliction of duty at the southern border.
I'll note that you didn't make any attempt to answer the actual question, which is who should be doing this? It would be an unprecedented government action. Who should go into Windsor or to Parker?
If the federal government is flying them in and busing them in, they can bus them out. They can fly them out. And certainly we have agents that can help assist in that. But before anything else, we have got to secure the border and shut it down. I have talked.
When you say federal agents, do you mean just Border Patrol, just ICE, or are you talking about
Guard, whatever it takes to keep our country safe?
How about local police, as Mr. Trump has said?
Anything to get our country back to some sort of normal is fine with me. And whatever President Trump puts out there, I certainly will talk with him and help enforce that.
Thank you very much. As you referenced, you introduced articles of impeachment against the president for his handling of the border. That move was blocked by Republican House leadership. They sent it to committees and said, pardon me, please.
To committee, it was
Pardon me,
not
please.
blocked.
It was blocked by sending it to committee, so you didn't get the full House vote that you wanted.
No,
so
I did get full House vote, and it was.
I apologize. This is going to be a long evening if you speak over the facts. Okay.
Right.
So, question for everybody up here. Please raise your hand if, based on what you know now, you would vote.
So here in the first follow-up, the moderator calls out the lack of attempt to answer the question, thereby marking the question as unanswered, by also calling out the candidate's behavior as contrary to the expectations of the debate. Attempting to answer a question comes with some sort of moral weight to it. The subsequent interaction has the moderator pursue answers using binary questions, clarifying questions, yes/no binaries, and of note, this set of questions produces answers to the specific questions. This style of interrupting with targeted follow-ups is also likely to be seen as a more aggressive way to pursue answers and hold the candidate accountable. Partisan viewers may also see this as biased. This is the type of exchange that went viral. We'll see one last example, and here we see not only the moderator identifying unanswered question multiple times, a pursuit, and then closing with meta commentary about evasion.
Need to support their family.
Mr. Sonnenberg, thank you. Ms. Flora, you often proudly note that you're from a military family. Your dad was an Air Force lieutenant colonel. You're the wife of an 82nd Airborne veteran. Let's talk about this idea of using the military, right? We've heard two people kind of talk about this already. Donald Trump is talking about it. How would that work if the National Guard or the military were to come into Douglas County where you live and start rounding people up?
Thank you. You know, I've been down to the border. I did an extensive period going from El Paso, Texas to Deming, New Mexico, Columbus, New Mexico, listening firsthand to Border Patrol, ICE, and DEA. And one of the things that I saw there was a beautiful partnership between the Texas National Guard. I sat in the backyard of a woman named Dolores. Her back fence is the border wall. She called it her freedom fence. And when the Texas National Guard was walking along, she goes, "Those are my heroes." She even said, "I throw cookies to them every day." So she might have quite an arm. But the reality is that's the partnership I'm talking about. It is time that we understand that drug cartels are actually pretty much a narco-terrorist military organization. The reality is they control our border. They control a vast majority of Mexico. That's my focus when it comes to the use of military. It's already working very well with the Texas National Guard. It's time that we allow our great men and women to focus on our #1 national security issue, which is our southern border. And then we can address the humanitarian aspect of it, which is a disaster here as well.
Just want to clarify. That's happening in Texas because a Republican governor has mobilized the Guard in that way. Democratic governor in Colorado is not going to do that. So the options would be send in the U.S. military or have a future President Trump nationalize the Guard under the Insurrection Act and say, you know, bring in guardsmen from out of state into Douglas County. You think that would work?
I think that it is time that we take it very seriously for what it is.
Would you like to answer the question?
I will, because I
gotta ask somebody that's
Mr.
military.
Mr. Holtorf, you've been interrupting people constantly. I would ask you to stop. Ms. Flora, could you please answer the question?
Yes.
Bringing in out-of-state National Guardsmen or the U.S. military in Douglas County, do you feel like that would work?
Not into Douglas County. That's not what I'm talking about. What I mentioned is to secure our border. That is what is required. And we also, by the way, have to stop the President of the United States from suing.
We're going to move on. The question was about the actual work of rounding people up in Douglas County, but we took a couple tries at that.
So here we have multiple attempts to try to get an answer. Yes, no binaries, meta commentary about what happens, continuing all the way till we get a sarcastic remark, marking it as unanswered, and a closing, well, it's okay, we took a couple of tries at that. Together, this set gives us ways of thinking about what is the responsibility of a nonpartisan debate moderator. I think it's a real likelihood that Kyle Clark's answer to this question is going to be different from the League of Women Voters. And in a democratic system, we may need all kinds. But I hope what this research does is it points to the potential that indirect techniques may be possible to find this balance slightly differently, that defending democracy may call for more than just a timekeeper, and that by identifying a range of techniques that can adjust to moderator values and perceptions of political risk, the inevitable option isn't between being Kyle Clark and just giving people 3 minutes to say whatever they want. Of course, this finding comes within the context of affective polarization, where what it means to be nonpartisan is really contested. Even indirect techniques and our problem formulation still include some blame pointers, even if they're a little less obvious and for more mundane infractions. It may be possible that truly defending democracy may cue accusations of political bias, and perhaps some moderators want to do that anyway. But hopefully this research helps groups like the League of Women Voters working at the community level with community volunteers who have a little less experience and expertise than someone like Kyle Clark have a sense of a range of possibilities that are available to them for upholding their important work for trying to defend democracy. With that, I will turn things over to the response and move us toward the question and discussion.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you so much. Here are a few comments I would like to add. Like I remember this summer when I first watched Kyle Clark and Marshall Dawson moderating. And you might also remember I was really surprised. And then, you know, I find myself hooked in the discussion as an outsider to the political atmosphere of the US. Then like I found myself going between this type of moderation does justice to the questions and also addresses public concerns, but also it kind of feels too adversarial too. And then like diving deeper into the data set we have and then reading literature about political debates and then having discussions with you, my ideas have changed. And in the case of political discussion, moderators are like having like dual roles. One as being professionals, like having certain professional codes, but also mediators who take into public concerns and questions and hold candidate accountable and make strategic choices. And I think this results from the professional conduct of impartiality, which you also mentioned. And but I think we should question this professional code of impartiality because like there are also other professional codes and commitments if the moderator is especially a journalist like doing live broadcasting. And then, you know, like I started thinking of like what can be other commitments and professional codes, like how about code of accuracy, how about code of accountability. And sometimes I feel like these codes and commitments can be in conflict with each other, and this creates the tension. And I think like questions are the space we can like most clearly see these tensions working. And although it sounds conflictual, sometimes different dynamics, such as being on the same ground as the audience, may influence the way questions are framed. And at this point, one of the pushbacks can be about being biased, which you also mentioned. However, I believe bias look different in different contexts. And here, framing what is happening as bias wouldn't feel fair to me based on these tensions that we have just witnessed. And which also I think resonates with the points you made about blame pointers. So like, how can we like frame them in such a way that like we are not pointing the blame to anyone? Because here the goal is not something partisan, it's something value neutral and addressing everyone. So in other words, like how about politically disengaged people? And how about the efforts to address this audience with the aim of increasing political participation, which I believe, which is one of the goals shared by the moderators. Then, you know, thinking like both to address the bigger audience, including politically disengaged folks and people who follow politics, and also dismissing claims of being biased or being partisan, shifting our focus to making non-answers hearable makes more sense. And I believe it also can help not only politically disengaged folks to be hooked, as me, you know, as an international student being hooked and following, oh, like what are they asking and how they are answering, but also everyone who is literally like into the politics and following what's happening closely. Um, I think this work is really valuable and I like had a lot of fun and I feel like I learned a lot while being involved as a research assistant. These are the comments I want to add. Like, do you want to add anything more to these, Leah?
Well, thank you for all of that. And I think that I heard new things and provocations from you is a sign of why I've so enjoyed being able to do this work together. And I think hearkening back to where you started, what counts as respectful and democratic and appropriate and biased these days is not a straightforward thing. And I find in more and more of my work, I'm having to contend with what vocabularies and moves and discourses are even available for things like neutrality, and are any of them any good, or are they all getting in the way? And so I think we're at a point where asking those questions is something many of us need to do in lots of spaces, and pointing to other professional codes as better resources for additional values, I think is a provocative way to think about that. I also think encouraging the league to think about pointing blame towards other democratic problems that they care about is also an interesting move. And perhaps it also might rhetorically be successful in that the League is willing to take some stands that are more controversial on some other issues, and thinking about that to perhaps spice up the responsibility of some of these candidate forums, while also being able to demonstrate that it's not all or nothing, I hope is perhaps some of the conversation and thoughtful reflection that research like this might be able to prompt.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely agree with you. So we will now open the floor for Q&A session. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window to post your questions. Let's see what we have. So maybe I can ask a question while waiting for people to type them in. So like I feel like, you know, like those tensions are the places like where we see like dilemmas or conflicts happening. So like based on your research of like looking at political communication, where else can we see those dilemmas are like, or and also, you know, like how can we bring up some democratic values?
So I see so many places where multiple democratic values are often in tension. And so perhaps it's not surprising that I say that I find GPT and Ada such a good resource, because it points to the kind of grappling of this inevitability of multiple values that are in tension. And you're not going to choose, for example, between inclusion and democratic legitimacy, or you're not going to say that it's, you know, either or. So thinking about everything from, I do a lot of interaction within public discussions and facilitation. So thinking about how something like power balancing recognizes the need for both kind of equity, but then doing things in unequal ways, and the ways in which that literature spends a lot of time thinking about how equity and equality are not the same thing, and how those get managed are in tension, to the ways in which in other spaces, values like calling out and identifying and taking a moral stance against injustice, it often comes in the form of doing that in ways that are going to be kind of widely understood and respected. And sometimes you kind of subject yourself to the very sort of critiques that we've been hearing here. I've worked with a number of community organizations that get really frustrated by that tension. And so I think there's all sorts of examples of places where kind of values come into conflict, both for individual speakers and for groups of people, and thinking about how they call for us to kind of communicate and act, and how doing them all the time poses a bunch of practical problems that I hope communication scholars and other sociolinguists help us think about, because of the kind of consequences of those moments.
Yeah, thank you for your response. I see some questions. So this is David Boramisa Habashi's question. Hi, David. He says, I'm wondering about the value of explicit meta discourse about politically biased questioning in the context of a debate. For example, what kind of work would an explicit statement about how League of Women Voters avoids politically biased questioning do at the beginning of a debate?
So my hunch is that the League of Women Voters is most likely to be attacked by either candidates refusing to come to their forums or in other venues. And so things like a vow within the forums can do a little bit of work in terms of kind of how they set things up. But it also can get them. And part of what the session I did with them made so clear to me is how hard it is to actually avoid politically biased questioning these days. For example, asking about abortion by a league of women voters that has long had that as part of their issue strategy after Roe versus Wade got overturned, is seen as a politically biased question, even if it's asked the same to all candidates in a debate. And so part, I think, about the trickiness is trying to avow any possibility for political bias can also make you subject to criticisms when you can't fully enact that in satisfying ways. And to be clear, I think sometimes democracy, if they truly want to defend democracy, it requires it. Trump didn't like the question about accepting the results of an election, but for an organization that cares about democracy to expect a president to accept the results of election, is that a politically biased question? Probably. Does it also need to be asked? Probably. So I think this points, David's question points to some of the rub between how easily we can accept that premise that the questions themselves won't be biased.
Yeah, thank you, Leah. We have a follow-up question from our team. Josh asked, like, what are the limits on how partisan audiences are or are not willing to take meta discourse at face value?
Yeah, so one of the things I talked with about the league, and I have to say it dispirited them greatly, is the way in which within partisan politics within a candidate, you often have partisans who are engaged in motivated reasoning. That is, they're already inclined to see things the way they already see things. And in turn, right now, we have deeply polarized groups that mean affectively groups tend to see themselves as us versus them. So when you have motivated reasoning by activated partisans who are likely to see the other side as the problem and us as the good guys who are under attack, and both parties, by the way, feel this way. That's the nature of affective polarization. I think some types of meta discourse claiming to be doing certain things can actually work against you. An example I use with my students all the time is when people say, trust me, does it guarantee trust or does it give you reasons to be skeptical what they're trying to claim through kind of this directive, right? Well, I think some meta discourse about being nonpartisan in the context of affective polarization ends up working some of the same ways. In other words, it only cues skepticism. And so explicit avowals aren't always trusted at face value.
Thank you for your response. Both are great questions, honestly. Liz Covell has a question. Liz says, interesting talk, thanks. I don't think I heard anything about the technique of the moderator repeating the answer and asking a clarifying question about that answer. Does that happen and does it work?
Yeah, so thank you, Liz, for this question. I think part of the reason we spend less time with this technique is this tends to be better at pursuing answers than it does about making non-answers hearable. In other words, if people were asking kind of clarifying questions and developing, they often at least had some portion of the question to deal with. I think it's notable that we focus on cases where people pretty much just ask the same question repeatedly. Some of the question pursuit that Kyle Clark gets into a version of this, especially in the excerpt that I showed with Lauren Boebert, where she does start answering who of the federal government she would want to be kind of engaged in addressing migrants. That I think gets a little bit closer to doing some of this clarifying work. But I think for the most part, my reaction is that clarifying questions do more about kind of getting us answers than they do about kind of highlighting non-answers.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Leah, for the response. And Celia Settlestone also has a question. Thank you so much, Leah, for your insightful presentation. I'm curious to ask because much of your research seems to have occurred before this past election. Does the current political climate change how politically bias is seen and accessed? My thought is that dodging question techniques isn't even needed anymore during the times of extreme polarization, and I'm fearing that the debate form itself might be threatened, as you have pointed out, by how politicians may choose not to show up to forums. Do you see a political landscape that is post-debate in some way?
So this is a great question, and points to the ways in which we're having this conversation in a moment of democratic crisis, which is not the only form of crisis that is going on. So a couple of things, and this may just provoke more questions from you all. First is, I don't think we were doing great in terms of extreme polarization before the election. So this is a case where I think we can certainly see the refusal to abide by democratic norms and procedures since inauguration has exploded. But much of the research on polarization suggests that many of those, they use these like temperature gauges on how people see the other side. Much of that is relatively consistent. And so are we post-debate? Well, I think we certainly had the potential of fracturing around whether or not debates were going to happen last time, especially at the presidential level, when you had jockeying for arguing who was going to debate and who wasn't, and how many debates they agreed to, and President Trump pulling out of debates. So I do think you already see some of that. I think it is notable at the local level that you do have some rewards for candidates participating in these events. So even someone like Lauren Boebert, a notorious congressperson from Colorado, participates in lots of debates, including by local organizations and the debates we showed you that were televised across Colorado. Even though she quite famously for a long time has refused to hold like town halls and other forums, right? So I do think there are some rewards for some candidates who can't get other types of free media, that debates are still an opportunity to kind of get themselves out there. And at least some candidates can't resist the ego boost that is they can show up their opponent on live television. And also the idea that debate, that clash back and forth, grounded in certain types of reason and charisma. And I think argumentation scholars argue between themselves a lot whether or not these presidential debates are actually good debates in terms of clash of ideas and challenge, or if they are opportunities for people to seem presidential, to make an impression, to these days more than not go viral. So it's not about the 2.5-hour debate. It's about the little clips that people can use to take and do things, that those still have some weight and benefit. But the skepticism, Celia, embedded in your question about how all of this works and how you didn't say it, but I will. Like, not answering questions seems to be such a mundane, tiny, boring political thing compared to all the things we're facing right now. And because of that, is it comparatively insignificant and not worthy of attention? I think that's a fair question for us all to be asking. And also, for groups like the League of Women Voters, having something to do and ways of doing that work that especially works on the local levels still feels meaningful to them. So the space betwixt and between, I think, is the tricky part here.
Thank you, Celia, and thank you, Leah. I found Celia's question really meaningful, and to give a more global perspective, what I see is, no, we don't lose debates, but debates change their form based on the regime that you are governed. but they still go on. And this is this can be an interesting like topic of study, like how debates are conducted under different regimes. John has a question. To follow up on the question already asked, it seems like in a mediatized context, the debate isn't actually about the content of the answers, but about charisma and about channeling a persona. Does your research point to whether there could be another format for discussing ideas that could be a format that might build on the strengths of debating but addressing its weaknesses?
Yeah, so much of my work draws on public deliberation, which often, frankly, thinks about other interactional contexts, not conventional debates. I did all this research because I had a community partner who was interested in it, and for better or worse, I let them guide my attention. But there have been multiple different experiments, often, although not exclusively on a local level, that try to think about some of these dynamics and think about how to work. And I think I'll talk through at least an example of one of them, but I want to point to how part of what's tricky about some of the formats is in a mediaized context where circulation is so valuable, finding the formats that work in a mediaized context is really important for candidates, and many of the experiments don't work well there. So for example, I was part of observing a local group who played off of a deliberative approach that a Center for Public Deliberation out of Houston has played with, which instead of just having local candidates come in and give you their talking points, instead they create a discussion around a deliberation where they have the candidate taking a key role and fielding questions and back and forth from a group of people. And the response is that it's a mixed audience, so they can't just favor kind of one part of their constituency versus others. So it kind of forces this context collapse that means like, what does it mean to speak to multiple audiences at the same time, but through a true kind of back and forth. Part of what's interesting there is like the participants in that experiment deeply asked follow-up questions. They were deeply disturbed by things like non-answers, but then they could do something about it, right? And so there are formats that think about what are the democratic goals and what interactional structures are available to make that possible. And I think in all sorts of ways, the debate interaction structure, perhaps most specifically in the form that the League of Women Voters uses, which is like, we'll give everyone equal time to answer the same question. We will comment on nothing. We will sanction no one. And that means that people can do whatever they want for 2 minutes, and that's fine. For that to feel like it doesn't uphold to what we really want, I think is really fair. But figuring out what formats both are satisfying for candidates so they will attend, and build on the kind of strengths of debating and address their weaknesses while also being things that can access mass publics. I don't know of a lot of good examples of fully doing that. And I think some things like town hall debates where a community member is the one asking their question, like, try it a little bit of that, but like not in deeply satisfying ways.
Yeah. Thank you, John, and thank you, Leah. Please join me in thanking Leah Sprain for wonderful discussion today. Our next event will be the colloquium titled as Reimagining Political Features, Co-Creating a Podcast with the Talking Politics series on Thursday, 29th of May, 2025 during SLA conference. And if you like to revisit any part of the presentation, or if you have friends who couldn't make it today, we will be sharing a link to the recording of the presentation at a later date through mailing list. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. Yeah, thank you again.